Okay, great. Thanks. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is James Yap. I'm the president of the Canadian Lawyers for International Human Rights, or CLAIR, which is the organization that's hosting today's event. We're excited to be, I'm also a lawyer based in Toronto, and I have a strong personal interest in the topic that's going to be discussed today, which is about ESG, or environmental and social governance. It's this movement for corporations that are trying to, instead of pursuing purely profit for shareholders, it's this idea that corporations should instead be while pursuing profit for shareholders, but also in a way that respects human rights and the environment. So we're very excited to have 4 speakers joining us today. Before we do that, though, for those who are joining us from international locations, it was customary in Canada before the pandemic to give a land acknowledgement to acknowledge the original Indigenous occupants of the land. Of course, we are now doing a virtual event, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out the land acknowledgement for Toronto, where I'm based, and any of you who may be on colonized land can also reflect on your own situations. So where I am in Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Others of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So we've got 4 speakers today from 4 different perspectives. So we're gonna have a very interesting discussion. I'm going to introduce them all very briefly in order to give them as much time as possible to talk about their own work themselves. First up, we have Joel Bakan, who is a professor of law at the University of British Columbia, and also an award-winning author and filmmaker, notably of the book/movie The Corporation, as well as the sequel, The New Corporation, both very worth checking out if you haven't already. Then we're gonna have a comment from Anita Dorett, who is the director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, who works with investors to try and influence corporations to respect human rights and the environment. And we're going to hear from Shin, who is a professor of law, now retired at Osgoode in Toronto, and who has worked extensively with communities in the Global South who have been affected by Canadian mining companies, notably in Latin America. And then finally, although she hasn't joined us yet, we're hoping to hear from Mónica Ospina, the founder and CEO of OTrade, who works with Canadian companies, or notably with mining companies, to help them improve their human rights practices and improve their relations with communities on the ground. So we're going to hear from each of our panelists for a total of about half an hour, roughly. Then we're going to move into a discussion phase for also moderated by my colleague Ankita Gupta, also for roughly about half an hour. And then we're going to have the last half an hour, roughly, devoted to a Q&A sessions where the audience can ask questions and engage with the speakers. And we do reserve the right to play around with these times a little bit. Finally, I will note that this meeting is being recorded. Our intention is to record, however, only the first and I guess the second part of the panel today. So that's the presentations of each panelist as well as discussion between the panelists. And then we intend to turn off the recording for the Q&A session in order to facilitate as much as possible an open and honest discussion with all the panelists and the audience. So with all that in mind, I'm now going to turn it over to Joel Bakan to give his presentation. Joel, go ahead.
Always forget to turn on the microphone. It's become almost a memic kind of thing with Zoom. Thanks, James. And I guess the question that you put out, is it possible to work within corporate structures to effectively advance human rights and environmental interests? You know, the short answer is yes, it's possible, but there is a profound limitation. And that is that human rights and environmental initiatives in a company can never be taken for the purpose of them being ends in themselves, at least not within publicly traded companies where managers are legally obliged to act in the best interests of the company and its shareholders. So that means you can only pursue these kinds of initiatives as means to the corporation's self-interested ends. You know, the best case scenario from the corporate perspective is that they actually help the bottom line. The worst case scenario is that they don't hurt the bottom line, but that's the range you have to work within. And I think within that formula, there's undoubtedly some room to do good things, to promote human rights and environmental interests. There's an interpretive range of plausible arguments for saying that this or that program is good for social and environmental reasons and also good for business reasons. And the more creative managers and employees in companies can sort of find that wiggle room, but it's still a limit. And the question really is, how much of a limit? How wide is the range? How wide is that wiggle room? How wide is the range for finding these alignments between social and environmental good and business good? And the sort of gist of my work in both the books and films that you mentioned, James, The Corporation and the New Corporation, is that that range is quite narrow. That sometimes companies can justify doing good because it will expand markets. An example of that would be Coca-Cola's programs to address world hunger by selling nutraceutical drinks in India. It's great for Coke because it creates new markets for them. They say it's great for the world because it's helping solve hunger, but there's actually little scientific evidence that it does have positive health effects. Just one serving of Coke's drink, Vitingo it's called, exceeds the World Health Organization's recommended daily sugar intake for a child. And this is at a time when childhood obesity is reaching crisis levels in the global south. And moreover, the implicit message is that somehow big corporations' products can solve world hunger, when we know that what's needed is structural change and measures that promote economic justice. So it's an example of how sometimes what appears to be good through the corporate lens, which necessarily has to include its own self-interest, may really not be good when thought about from broader scientific and objective ways. I mean, companies will also pursue reputational benefits and sometimes do good things, like Amazon promises in the wake of George Floyd's brutal police murder, promises to, quote, stand in solidarity with the Black community to fight systemic racism and injustice. But at the same time, it continues to aggressively fight the efforts of its 70% African-American and Latino workforces in the US to organize unions in order to promote and improve their working conditions. So, you know, again, there's that problem. Sometimes corporations will be able to save money through sustainability measures, like, you know, in a hotel room, you find a little card saying, don't reuse your towels, save the planet. Well, of course, that saves them money. So, but, you know, so again, sometimes they can do some good that also helps them do well. And then sometimes corporations will pursue certain apparent goods because it propagates a particular view of their issue and helps them fend off regulation and get positive sort of public feedback. And I think a great example of this, and there are many, is the way the fossil fuel industry has embraced the climate agenda, goes to all the meetings and tries to exert their influence. But what is the solution they're providing? It's things like natural gas or carbon offsets or carbon capture, all of which have been heavily criticized by climate scientists, by climate thinkers, but each of which strongly aligns with the industry's interest to continue exploration, continue drilling, and ramp up fracking. So all of this is to say that when human rights and the environment are not ends in themselves, which they can't be for corporations, we need to be pretty careful not to get too excited and pretty skeptical about how they are defining good and whether the good in the way they define it is in fact good. Which takes me to the second question, which are the advantages and drawbacks of advocating human rights through ESG. And I think that, some of you might say, well, okay, we know all the stuff you're talking about. Yeah, corporations can be hypocritical and deceptive and all that. And we know that we have to be realistic in our expectations, but surely it's better than nothing that corporations at least try to do some good, even if it's limited. And I guess what I want to argue is that I actually think it's worse than nothing. And the reason for that is because there's a way in which ESG and CSR and all these other things are slyly used by companies and their advocates to try to convince us that it's them, not governments, that should be taking the lead, that they've now evolved into conscientious and responsible actors, and we should welcome rather than resist their growing power, their growing impunity, and their growing control over our lives and society. And this is a key argument I make in my work. And what I've observed is this alignment between the ESG movement, or what I call the new corporation movement, and the propagation and promotion of the neoliberal program. The idea is that corporations should be freed from regulation because now as good actors, they can regulate themselves, that they should be granted more control over public services through privatization because now as publicly minded entities, they can do a better job than government. And so for me, that would be the main drawback of advocating for human rights and other social and environmental goods through ESG within the corporate space. Doing so, I think, and I've observed and I've argued, is providing tangible support and justifications for corporations to govern society more and be governed by it less. So I'll stop there.
Hey, no, thanks for that, Joel. It was really interesting as well. And I'm just going to sort of jump in. And again, thanks to Claire for organizing this session. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction. My name is Anita Dorett, as James mentioned. I am the director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, which is an initiative of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. This Investor Alliance for Human Rights was set up about 4 years ago. And what we are really looking at is to try to focus on what constitutes or how do we support investor community to look at responsible investing. I.e. looking at investment activities that really support the fundamental rights of people. And in that context, we use the UN Guiding Principles, which provides a human rights framework to look at rights respecting business conduct. The Investor Alliance for Human Rights is based in New York, so I'm based in New York, and we have about 220 members, which are institutional investors from around the world. We represent sort of 18 countries, and in total, the assets that these sort of 220 members represent is over 10 trillion in assets under management. And the reason I'm just sort of raising this is that when we sort of get into the conversation, we are really going to talk about, investor leverage and the idea of collective leverage of what this investor group can then use in order to influence companies in their human rights responsibilities. But before I kind of jump into that, I just also wanted to give you a little bit more background. While I've been doing this work for the last 3 to 4 years, I have been a attorney and a private practice attorney for the last I've been an attorney for the last 25 years. The first 8 years in private practice doing primarily mergers and acquisitions work, and the subsequent years as in-house corporate counsel in technology firms. So that's kind of my background, which I hope will bring sort of different aspects to the discussion, or the very interesting discussion that we hope to have today. So with that, I kind of wanted to jump into the questions that Joel had sort of tackled as a start. And I think the first one related to, is it possible to work within corporate structures to effectively advance human rights and environmental issues? And I guess I wanted to kind of take a step back to say, I think we need to really just start with the basics, where we're looking at not even the issue of advancing human rights, but really just respecting human rights in its business operations. Because, respecting human rights is a separate issue. I mean, it leads to advancement of human rights, but advancement of human rights is kind of taking things a step further. And what we have today is corporations that are not even really looking at respect for human rights through their business activities and their business relationships. So as I mentioned earlier, we use the UN guiding principles and the human rights due diligence framework as the way in which we engage with companies or engage with investors in terms of addressing human rights risk and embedding rights respecting business behaviors as part of day-to-day operations. So in the context of that question, can it work within the corporate structures? The UN Guiding Principles is actually a framework that had been created specifically to operate within corporate structures. And so I echo what Joel said, that yes, it can happen. And the UN Guiding Principles have been around for now 11 years. What it does is, in all corporations, they have what they call their ERM, or their enterprise risk management structures. Every corporation has that. Every board or board of directors will sit around the table with their risk management committee, and they will go through enterprise risk management systems. One of these enterprise risk management systems needs to be human rights and environmental risk management system. So what the UN Guiding Principles provides in that context is a human rights risk management system that should then be embedded within corporate culture, within a corporate structure, and become part of their enterprise risk management structures. And that is really what we're advocating for, and we're asking investors as well, investors being businesses themselves and corporations themselves, to really embed that human rights due diligence policy processes within their corporate structures in terms of how then they operate their investment activities. And in doing so, they will then be engaging with their portfolio companies and other corporations which they invest in, to ask them to do the same. So it's kind of a circuitous process, and it can sound pretty basic, because what the human rights sort of due diligence framework requires one to have a public commitment to respect human rights, and that can be seen to be sort of very much lip service. But in a corporate environment, if you don't have a policy, then you'll never have a process. You'll never have resources allocated to it. And so starting with a human rights policy, a public commitment that is endorsed at the highest levels within the corporation, and that the board of directors have accountability for, is really key in really pushing that respect for human rights within an organization. Where the board has accountability for the human rights performance of a company, or the human rights, or to have rights respecting business operations and relationships, then they are then answerable to the shareholders. There will be resources allocated in sort of ensuring that on a day-to-day basis that is being observed. in that context, I wanted to just give an example of what is already operating within a corporate structure that can then sort of be drawn a parallel with human rights and environmental risks. So today we have structures that are built in to address fraud and anti-bribery and corruption risks. That is a risk of how you conduct your operations, what kind of relationships you have. And that includes having a policy, having baked into decision-making process, in fact, issues around, compliance, corruption compliance by design, is really a structure and a process that already is existing within many corporations, and can be a similar concept can then be used in the context of human rights and environmental risks. And sort of moving on from there, the question relating to the advantages or the drawbacks of advocating for human rights through the ESG lens or other forms of advocacy within the corporate space. ESG today is really the buzzword that is being used, and it kind of is supposed to encompass non-financial risks. I mean, companies have always been addressing financial risks or what they consider to be material risks. And so now ESG is being used to define what is non-financial risk. And two things I wanted to bring up in that context is that when you look at human rights, and I guess this is one of the drawbacks that I see in terms of ESG risks. People then, in terms of human rights, companies have started to articulate human rights as one of the indicators or one of the risks under the S category. And that is really not the case. Human rights is a framework. It's an international framework that cuts across E, S, and G. And so by sometimes using that kind of terminology as well, we try and pigeonhole risks that need to be looked broadly and not more narrowly. And so that's one of the things that we're really pushing to say human rights risk is not one of the risks under the S category or the social category. The impacts might come up more under the S risk, but it really is a framework that needs to govern environmental governance and social risks. And in that context as well, the whole issue of companies have always been operating on the basis of increasing shareholder value. And that has always been thought in the context of increasing shareholder value ensures that you're paying the highest dividends, and there is capital gains in the equity that has been invested in the company. And that has really spun a 180-degree turn where investors as well, and these include the large asset managers and mainstream managers, really, embracing the fact that shareholder primacy is not what we're looking at anymore. We are really looking at long-term shareholder value, and looking at long-term shareholder value is where you're looking at, companies that are operating and that will continue to hold their value on a long-term basis, that is resilient in situations where there are crises. For example, the COVID crisis that laid bare gaps within, the corporate contracts, the social contracts, the environmental construct in terms of workers. And so I guess what I see in this context is that looking at ESG risk has really sort of helped companies to articulate the fact that they are no longer looking at risk from one perspective, but looking at it from perspectives of other stakeholders, shareholders being only one of those stakeholders, looking at it from the perspective of workers, communities, and civil society. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Shin.
Great, thanks very much. I'm just going to, is my voice coming through okay? Okay, I'm going to do a little PowerPoint, and so we can start off with a little group reading exercise here. Ankita, is this showing up okay? Okay.
Yes.
So justice and corporate accountability, we started at Osgoode Law School, and now we're at located in a few law schools. We're a volunteer organization, and our motto is communities first. So rather than starting from the corporation and what they want to do, we kind of look at the impact of mining activities on the communities. And I just want to illustrate through an example of how mining companies and corporate social responsibility interact. The International Council of Mining and Minerals is the largest industry organization for mining. All the big players, Barrick Gold, Teck, we'll go through a number of them, BHP, Vale, they all belong to this. And they have these, this organization. I'll just give you a second to read this slide. So they're not a lobby group or trade association. They're a global leadership organization, and they want to create safe, just, and sustainable world. So they are always challenging themselves to go ever further in setting the highest standards for responsible mining. So they have a set of mining principles. And I'm not, obviously going to go through all of them. I think I'm just going to highlight 3 or 4 of them. This one is about remunerating employees. Okay, regular and overtime working hours. This is about tailings dams, tailings storage. For those of you who don't know, when mines, of course, create waste, and then they create these tailings. And a big thing is how they try to store them. Minimize the risk of catastrophic failure. This is about Indigenous people. Consent processes in agreements. They want to protect critical cultural heritage. Okay, so I'm going to go through 5 or 6. I'll see how much time I have, and just give you specific examples of what these companies do. I want to thank a couple of volunteer lawyers that did some of this research for me, Claire Boychuk and Leslie Ann St. Amour. Okay, Barrick Gold, Canada, Peter Monk, you've all heard of him, huge player in Canada. These guys, for 5 years, women from their Papua New Guinea mine went to Barrick's annual general meeting saying that their security guards were involved in gang rape. Peter Monk's reply to the, and I'll say this quoting from the Globe and Mail, it would be impossible to police the behavior of 5,500 employees, particularly in countries where gang rape is a cultural habit. So he let gang rapes go on for 5 years. 100 or more women were gang raped during that time, and it took NGOs, particularly like students from Harvard and Columbia, went to Papua New Guinea to document all this. And finally, he fired some people. I'm not saying the situation is good, but at least he recognized these rapes were going on. Teck, this is another Canadian company. I'm not going through all the controversies associated with the company. I'm just giving you a taste. And this is only not all the companies, but Tech is a Canadian company. In 2012, they got a $60 million fine for the worst, the highest fine for polluting rivers in British Columbia, largest fine in Canadian history. In 2018, they got another judgment, $8.25 million for decades of toxic waste into the Columbia River. Rio Tinto is a Australian mine, and you may have remembered one of their principles is about Indigenous people and consent. In 2020, they blew up a 46,000-year-old Aboriginal caves, 46,000 years of continual occupation against the, of course, the Aboriginal people did not want that blown up. And they knew, because they had been engaged for 17 years, they said, for these people, and they said, oh, it was a misunderstanding. We didn't realize they didn't want us to blow it up. Rio Tinto was also involved in Papua New Guinea. Over 1 billion tons of waste tailings were released directly into the Java and Kawarong rivers during their operations. Vale, 2019, Brumadinho, this was a tailings pond. They had heard for years that there was problems in it. They didn't do anything about it. It burst, 270 people killed, whole villages wiped out. The engineers who had been pressured to approve keeping the dam operated have been indicted. A bunch of their senior executives indicted for murder. Minera San Rafael in Bolivia is a subsidiary of Sumitomo in Japan. They had this, the headline, here's a great headline, Sumitomo scores legal victory in Bolivia. And you know what that legal victory was? They were able to overturn a arbitration judgment giving the union the right to receive overtime pay and weekend hours. Orano, they're a uranium company in France. They were involved in corruption in Niger and also involved in price fixing in the European Union. Newmont, JCAP, we have represented a small indigenous community or a campesino community in Peru for 10 years. We just got our teeth kicked in at, unfortunately, at the highest court in Peru. Very disappointing. The situation here was that Newmont, which is the largest gold company in the world now, bought or had the Peruvian government during the dictatorship of Alberto Fujimori confiscate this piece of land from the community, paid $30,000 for it. Within 6 months, they had mortgaged the land for $85 million. And so, you know, and had the leaders of the community were corrupt and they didn't share it with anybody else. So yeah, we fought this for 10 years. They just through all the lawyers from the States, everybody's paid. We're paying. We're all volunteers. Lawyers in Peru are volunteers. The community is so isolated, they don't even have access to cell phones. They have to come down from the hills to a town, and that's Newmont. Newmont and Barrick are the biggest players on the CSR scene in in the world. And you go to any conference, they're all over it. So, just to get to the question, can you work from the inside? I have no idea whether you can work from the inside. Looking from the community up, this ESG stuff means nothing. And the ICMM is it's total greenwashing. There is no, if you have a complaint against one of their companies, they'll just refer, and your phone, you contact ICMM, they'll just refer you back to the company. They say, we don't get involved in that. We're a leadership organization. We just set up standards, Sorry, you have to figure out what the company is doing. They have this thing called internal verification to make sure that all the members adhere to their very high standards and their ambitions to do better. This verification is basically self-verification. And so it'd be a lot wonderful, for at law school, university, if we could also do self-evaluation and give the grades that we think. But anyways, that's the way they operate. So I'm just going to end there with the specific examples. So thanks, and I'm sorry I went a bit over time.
Not at all. Thank you, Shin, so much, and thank you to everyone for your wonderful and very informative presentations. We were hoping to have Mónica Ospina join us. She has not been able to do so yet. She conveys her apologies. We are working on trying to get her later on, but for now, we apologize to anyone who was hoping to hear her speak and is disappointed. We are hoping to at bringing her in. But for now, I guess we have a bit more time to hear from the wonderful guests who are with us. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ankita Gupta, who is going to moderate the next phase of the discussion.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Joel, Shin, Anita, for your presentations. They were very informative. I just want to mention to the audience that please start thinking of your questions if you don't already have them. And if you have questions already in mind, please message my colleague James or Andrew, and they'll just keep a queue of the questions that we have that we can then open up to. So please feel free to drop them a quick message that you have a question, and they'll keep the queue. I have 3 sets of questions that I'm hoping to get through for the 3 of you. And I think, Shin, your presentation ended off at a really good point that I'd like to start off with communities, right? What does ESG mean for communities? How do we ensure that, ESG policies and programs are actually benefiting communities on the ground? And so I'd like to go back to both Joel and Anita on that front to ask the both of you, how relevant are a company's ESG policies for a community, and how should companies be designing ESG policies, keeping in mind communities and engaging with communities? I don't know if Joel, you want to start off?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think Shin really said it all on this topic. These programs tend to be, whether it's ESG or CSR or corporate sustainability or whatever, they tend to be very top down. They tend to be created by well-intentioned managers. I am not aware of any real attempts to consult with groups. In other words, it's decided on the part of the Coca-Cola company thinks it's a good idea to apply nutraceuticals to solve hunger in India. I don't know if they go, in fact, I doubt very much that they go and talk to activists on the ground about a diverse range of activists on the ground about what is required to solve hunger in India. If they do consulting, I wonder who they consult with, whether they have mechanisms for ensuring that they're consulting in an inclusive way, in a way that ensures that divisions within communities are properly dealt with. But my sense is there isn't much consulting going on at all, let alone rich and diverse consulting. So I think in terms of, what does it mean for communities on the ground and how should they be designed? To begin with, like Shin, I'm skeptical about these programs from the get-go. and would much prefer to see democratic government processes, rights-based organizations, sort of full range of solution-oriented work being done that isn't bound by the requirement to make sure it's good for the investors and to make sure, even in the long term, I mean, short term, long term, it's still about putting the investors' interests first. So if we want to solve a problem, let's go to the community, let's work with the community, let's find out how that problem has to be solved. Let's see the problem solution as an end, not a means. Let's not have it bound by the need to make profit for distant shareholders in the global north, and on and on and on. You know, I think the whole system is wrong. And it's wrong in a way that entirely excludes the genuine participation of communities.
No, and so I guess my perspective on this is, and I'm looking at it again from the perspective that I started out with, which is what are corporations' responsibility to respect human rights? And those are human rights of those who are impacted, stake rights holders are impacted, which would of course include communities. These are communities that they might serve as consumers. These are communities that might live in the vicinity around their, around their operations, and in various other ways, but, looking at it sort of more broadly. And so what, again, using the UN guiding principles, the idea is that corporations in respecting human rights need to understand what are the human rights of different rights holders, including communities that are impacted by their operations. And in order to do that, they need to carry out what is called a human rights impact assessment. So in carrying out a human rights impact assessment, the idea would be that you would hire someone they would appoint someone who's independent, who has particular skill sets, and that would go into local, the geographies and local vicinities of where companies operate and have conversations, not with just with communities, with human rights organizations, with civil society organizations that represent those communities. So making human rights impact assessments as a standard process or a standard business process needs to happen. And when that happens and is implemented in a robust way, the views of communities, the engagement of communities has to be part of that process. So that is what, in a sense, I guess we're looking at. And I wouldn't necessarily use the ESG language, but where you are looking at financial and non-financial risks. I mean, at the end of the day, a human rights risk, which is kind of deemed to be a non-financial risk, as both Joel and Shin as well alluded to, really becomes a financial risk if you ignore it. Looking at it from a human rights lens, the issue is that you look at these risks from the lens of the community to understand how serious that risk is. And in order to do that, you need to speak to the communities, to human rights organizations, to get that. And so taking then that, sort of flipping that around from the investor perspective as well. So the investors are, and what we are looking to do with working with investors as well is to assess how companies are doing that and to push them in the direction of asking for such human rights impact assessments. So if you look at a range of, shareholders have a number of tools. One of the tools that they do often use where they're not able to get an answer from the company is to put a proposal at the annual general meetings of the companies. And this will happen primarily in North America, in both Canada and in the US. And if you look at a number of the resolutions that have been put forward, it's usually asking for a human rights impact assessment to understand the impact of business on a particular community or relating to, and that community could be users as well. So in the case of, look at a resolution that's being put forward in Facebook, for example, where they're asking, to conduct a human rights impact assessment that impacts the looking at targeted advertising, discriminatory practices that impact users and other communities. So I hope that helps.
That does. And I guess I want to take a step back, Shin, and take a step back from ESG. As a form of soft law, is ESG enough, or are hard laws needed to take it further? And so in specific, I'd like to ask you, are you encouraged by the developments we're having with the imposition of mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence on corporations, the binding treaty, statements by investment banks, pension funds, and other market actors? Are these other developments encouraging, or what is needed beyond ESG?
Yeah, no, I think Joel said that all this ESG stuff was worse than nothing. The way I look at it is, the companies feel like they have to do it because feel like they have to address it because people really, they do care about it. The way the companies do address it is a little misleading. But so I think that in general, this movement addressing these issues, I think is a very good thing. I think that, the example I said with the ICMM is that if you just leave it up to the companies to come up, and they can come up with beautiful words because they just hire great consultants. They don't really care. They hire these consultants to write these great policies, and they put them up on the website. Every company has beautiful policies, beautiful pictures of happy people. I mean, just go to any mining site. It's really heartwarming. And but the CSR people in these companies have no power. Nobody reports to them. They are basically the public relations people for these companies. And so I think that you do need, like the initiatives of the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability on the due diligence legislation, on trying to give the ombudsman teeth. I mean, that's where it has to head. I think there's huge challenges to that. And I think that one of the ways to deal with the challenges is to show people that this greenwashing by organizations like ICMM are ineffective, and that you actually need to have a mechanism that gives the community some access to some type of remedy.
Anita, you wanted to,
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of chime in there to say that, fully agree with Shin that there is a need for regulation. There needs, and with, relating to that question, I mean, we've been waiting for a while. I mean, the fact is that voluntary measures have not worked. There is a need for mandatory measures to be put in place. And so in terms of what is then happening, particularly in the EU and in Europe, with mandatory human rights due diligence or mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence laws coming to place, corporate disclosure requirements as well, and reporting, that is then, pushing companies to have to conduct human rights due diligence, provide more disclosures in that area. And there are as well, we hope to see liability resulting from a failure to take action as required, or to, under these laws. Of course, I mean, there is a lot going on with these laws at the moment in terms of its discussion, negotiations, etc. And so we hope to have, robust frameworks in place. But, so that is, I mean, in Europe, you see really the legislature and the government sort of taking that action to really reflect what, consumers, the citizenry is wanting, and giving enforceability to international law norms. Whereas in the US, what we are seeing here is the capital markets, and I'm trying to give that sort of perspective, right? The capital markets are driving that need for more disclosures and more mandatory requirements from companies to take into account non-financial risks. So, I mean, of course, there is always going to be risk of greenwashing, and that happens across the piece. But what you're seeing now is investors asking for more sustainability, you know, for investments that reflect a sustainability agenda by companies. So that helps to drive how companies' behaviors are, what kind of disclosures they put out there. But also on the flip side of it, you see the SEC. I mean, the federal sort of system in the US prevents laws from being put in place. So you see now the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission in the US putting forward proposals relating to ESG or environmental and climate change disclosures. So that is in a way then driving that sort of mandatory element to human rights and environmental issues.
Okay, that's very helpful. So Joel, I want to bring you into this discussion as well and ask that beyond ESG and the hard law initiatives that we've discussed, should there be other means that we're considering to get corporations to take human rights and environment seriously? So what role can workers play? What role can consumers play? Civil society, governments? What are the expectations on these different actors that we should have?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting discussion because when we think about ESG, there are really two paths or two arguments that can be made. One argument is that, well, ESG is great because it kind of puts the issues on the table and then eventually things crystallize from voluntary into mandatory kinds of norms. The other argument, which tends to be the argument that I gravitate towards, which is why, as Shin pointed out, I said ESG may be worse than nothing. The other argument is that ESG proposes a model of voluntarism that then is used in order to push against successfully mandatory regulations. And so I think when we're talking about mandatory regulations, we have to be really clear that we're talking about, you mentioned, Ankita, you mentioned government. We're talking about government regulations that are independently monitored and enforced through the coercive authority of the state. If a bunch of investment groups or NGOs or some combination of those or UN organizations all get together and decide we're going to create, quote, mandatory norms, there aren't really any mechanisms for enforcement. They're still voluntary. They're just formalized voluntary norms. And so I think we have to be really, really clear what we mean by mandatory is sovereign authority of the state to penalize offenders of those norms. And that gets really, really mushy in this whole discussion. Another thing that gets really mushy in this discussion is the kind of norms we're talking about. Typically, I mean, we have many examples of regulation, of requirements that you're not allowed to exploit workers that are imposed by governments through legislation, that are enforced by governments. There's nothing new in that idea. But now we're starting to talk about mandatory ESG regulations. And those are often quite different. They're often quite more diffuse, they're more general, they are about disclosure, or they're about trying to practice best practices or general standards about being nice to animals and people, but they're not those very granular kinds of things that we're used to when we talk about regulatory norms, that you're only allowed to put this much effluent into the river, that you have to pay a worker this much money, that you can't do this to try to bust their union. So there's a way in which ESG is pushing even the mandatory space to a much more diffuse kind of space and away from regulation. And for me, that's just another kind of this neoliberal deregulation. So we say the norms are mandatory, but they're so broad as to have very little meaning. We also push them into the international space from the domestic space, like with the Ruggie principles, where we say we're going to impose direct obligations on corporations. But we well know that international law has very little means of enforcement. And so when we push onto, when we make the corporation an actor in international law having responsibilities, we're again diffusing the possibility of real effective regulation. So I guess my concern is that through the ESG movement, this kind of argument that, oh, it's great because it helps push us towards mandatory norms, we have to really think about first, whether it's doing that or whether it's pushing us in the opposite direction. And second, whether the kind of mandatory normative system it's pushing us towards is one that's really effective, especially compared to the kind of system it's pushing us away from, which is a system that doesn't trust corporations to be responsible and instead imposes granular and enforceable norms upon them.
I just wanted to share this question with Anita and Shin to see if they also have any thoughts before we open it up to the audience.
Yeah, just Joel, just so you don't think that I think that company-sponsored ESG is a good thing and that's going to lead us to the next step. I agree with you, quite the opposite. What I take heart from is that they are responding. I mean, because all this discussion can get pretty depressing, especially, you know, for me, everything I touch, I see, you know, I lose all my court cases. It's not a happy space to work in. But I mean, I think that we can take encouragement that they feel like they have to put out this stuff because people care.
Mm-hmm.
People care about these issues, and you know, if the company's twisting it and manipulating whatever, I mean, that's what the company's doing. But they're having to do this because people care about these things. So I think that, you know, can the fact that people care push this to another level? And I think it'd be nice. Because I represent community, we are always working on just marginal improvements. Like we're not looking at the big picture because that doesn't help a community. If we tell them, you know, well, let's get rid of capitalism, that's going to solve your problem. That doesn't help them in the moment. But I think that, you know, in the end, what we need is what Joel's talking about. Like, there are so many limitations with the way that the whole economy is structured now that it's inevitable that if we make progress, it's just going to be marginal progress on the edges. And, you know, I feel that's worth fighting for the communities, but I don't think that's a long-term solution any more than having companies adopt ESG standards as voluntary is a long-term solution.
Maybe I could just quickly jump in on that and agree with you and say it is great that people care. But I think what worries me is that they'll believe that caring can actually have impact in dealing directly with companies. And getting back to Ankita's original point, I think that caring of people has to be funneled through democratic institutions, through political activism, through unions, through you know, protests in the streets, through all of those other means, but not through a sense that if they just try to talk to these corporations, that will be okay. And my main concern is that ESG presents corporations with all the nice pictures that Shin mentioned at the website as talkable too, and they're not.
And that's where the role of civil society comes in, right? You know, that's where, I mean, you know, we need to have some frameworks in place. We need to have some progress, you know, even if sometimes that progress seems to dilute or seems to dilute the impact of it. So I'm going to try and give some examples where we're seeing, I mean, when we talk about these sort of international norms and how does international norms get implemented by corporations. So, I mean, I'm just going to give you sort of one example that's happening in the US now in terms of, we're talking about discrimination as an issue. And of course, this is a very sort of US-centric issue around racial equity and racial discrimination. And so how, and I'm putting this, I mean, I'm giving you this perspective also from how investors are approaching this, and investors are working with civil society organizations. So what investors have been asking in this current annual, so again, I mentioned earlier that one of the tools that investors have in terms of pushing companies is putting proposals forward at annual general meetings. So I believe this year there is, I can't remember the offhand, but there are more than 30 requests being made by companies to conduct racial equity audits. That racial equity audit is grounded on civil rights that, US civil rights laws that are based on international norms. And so that's one way in which, we are trying to hold companies to account for those protections or for that respect that they need to have in accordance with international law. So that was one example that I wanted to give. We are seeing companies conduct racial equity audits. What that is tantamount to in terms of what kind of wash that happens, how they end up spinning it. I mean, those are always risks that are going to be there. But those are some steps forward. And one of the other things that I just wanted to quickly raise as well is that in terms of conducting these, when companies, we talked a little bit about, companies having these, policies and these great brochures, etc., that kind of become a public relations story. And there is a lot to that. What is very important then is to ensure that the board has accountability for those obligations. So they have accountability for the human rights performance of a company. If the board has accountability for that, then there is, I guess, a requirement that in carrying out their fiduciary duty, they have to allot the relevant resources in order for them to be held accountable, and investors intend to hold them accountable. So, for example, one of the things that is happening this year is we are asking the board of directors of Facebook to review the effectiveness of their risk and human rights committee that they have put in place sort of 3 years ago to address the risk of hate speech and and misinformation, and the fact that this committee is completely ineffective because this is continuing on such a vagrant level. And so, those are the ways in which you need to hold companies to account. And it seems like small steps, but it is steps that will continue to, hopefully push the goalpost. And I see Mónica has joined.
Thanks, Anita. Thanks so much to everyone. And yes, as you mentioned, we're in luck. We've been able to have Mónica join us. Thanks so much to Mónica, as well as my colleague Andrew, for helping make that happen. Mónica, thanks for joining us. And at this point, I know you're kind of joining midstream here, but why don't you say a few words about who you are, the work you do, and maybe some of your experience with your perspective working with corporations to try and help them improve their human rights practices and their relations with communities.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, James, and thank you for the invitation. And to all of you attending, apologies, I joined later. Is all of this world of still one thing after the other, but I certainly find that the discussion that you guys organized today is extremely important. In my experience, I have been working for 20 years around how you can integrate communities into operational effectiveness and readiness of projects. And a lot of my work has been in the extractive industry, oil, gas, and mining, where the industry touches and works in regions, in remote areas, a lot of in rural areas, where communities, sadly, in many cases, have been literally led to their good good luck by their own governments. Sometimes they don't even know there are settlements in certain regions, and the industry is the only one that figured out and how we can make that interaction effective, conflict-free, and productive for everybody. And productivity in communities translates into economic stability and moving out of poverty. In some other cases, it can be a disaster too. But I'm not going to say this is just a rose. It could be a disaster, and we have seen disasters too. So, but going on the bright side, I think that there are few elements that are becoming very important here. Democracy worldwide has a big increase in number of people, number of countries that are democracies today. It is a huge pressure. Probably we see it very at the high level, but I think it's huge because it is calling for participation processes in permitting, for example. And those are elements that start giving communities the ability at least to ask the right questions or be part of informed and their voice has to be heard. I'm not going to say this is perfect, by the way, but I'm going to say that this opens an avenue that was ignored for hundreds of years, in which communities, in many cases, they didn't even have a voice, and they just have to bend the knee to masters and do what they can just for survival. And now on the side of the corporate side, we are seeing also that pressure around, in the case of minerals, is the conflict-free minerals and the pressure of supply chains to make sure that there is a healthy supply chain that they can guarantee, and traceability is important here. Transparency comes in a spectacular way to start exploring how companies and who are they sourcing. And we have seen the stories of companies at Apple that we carry, or other companies that now they start kind of being very much aware. Philips, I think, is a stellar example because they started this process more than 20, 30 years ago when they were to start tracking, making sure that any mineral that they use in the supply chain can, in a way, as much as possible, demonstrate there was no conflict. It is a lot to be done. At the same time, I will say, if you allow me, it's a lot of education that needs to happen at the community levels. Sometimes in the communities, I work at the grassroots, and it's interesting when you see that everything is right. For them, everything is a human right. And that also creates a tension between the private sector and the communities, because not everything is a right, number one. And on the other side, they also have rights. So in a case that I had with indigenous peoples, when we started the process by acknowledging their rights, and that was the best, I think that I will advise this to everybody, start acknowledging their rights, because that allows a conversation that allows them to respect your rights. So I was mentioning to them, as you want to be safe, I would love that all the geologists team going prospecting an area go home. They also have families and they have to be safe too. There's no need of kidnapping anybody just to get something for you. So it comes in a way, and that piece for the corporate side is, and communities in that dialogue around acknowledging our rights, it leads to the most important element, that is responsibility. I'm also responsible for the rights. I hold and responsible for your rights. And that is when common ground start happening and building. I'm saying it's not easy, but it is. I honestly believe that is the best avenue. So thank you very much, James.
Thanks, Monica.
Thanks, Monica. So it's lovely to meet you. So at this point, we have more questions that we can ask all the lovely panelists, but we want to open it up to the audience to know if there's any questions. So I'm going to pause the recording for now for there to be a frank discussion, and just please use the raise hand function to ask any questions you may have, and we can and let us know if there's a particular panelist you have a question for.